"You don't investigate kindness," the mayor said, his voice echoing across the packed town hall, sharp and certain, especially when it doesn't follow the rules. The room fell into a tight, uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant rumble of a pickup truck passing down Main Street, and at the center of it all stood an old man who looked like he didn't belong in any of it, Thomas Hale, 78 years old, shoulders slightly bent, hands resting loosely at his sides as if he had all the time in the world, wearing a faded brown jacket that had seen more winters than anyone in that room cared to count. His eyes steady, calm, and unreadable as they moved slowly across the faces staring back at him, some curious, some annoyed, some already convinced he was the problem they had been looking for, because over the past 6 months something strange had been happening in this town, something quiet and almost invisible, mortgages paid off overnight, hospital bills cleared without explanation, power shut-off notices disappearing before they could take effect, envelopes showing up on kitchen tables with just enough cash to keep a family afloat for another month, no signatures, no notes, no credit taken, just help that arrived exactly when it was needed and vanished just as quickly, and at first people called it a blessing, then a miracle, and finally, when enough money moved without a name attached to it, they called it suspicious, and that was when Mayor Daniel Brooks decided it needed to be stopped, because systems, in his world, did not allow for ghosts, especially generous ones, and now every eye in that room was fixed on the man they believed was behind it all, the man who had been seen on a grainy security camera placing a plain white envelope into a mailbox at 2:13 a.m., the man who had walked away before anyone could thank him, Thomas Hale, who stood there now without a lawyer, without a statement prepared, without anything that looked like a defense, just that same quiet stillness that seemed to absorb the tension around him without giving anything back. "You've been entering private properties, delivering untraceable funds, interfering with financial processes," Brooks continued, pacing slowly like he was building a case that couldn't possibly be questioned, "and you expect us to believe this is, what, charity?" A few people nodded, others shifted in their seats, unsure how to feel now that kindness had been reframed as a problem, and Thomas didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't even change his posture, he simply listened, the way a man listens who has heard worse accusations in harsher places and learned long ago that not every truth needs to be defended out loud. "Where is the money coming from, Mr. Hale?" Brooks pressed, his voice tightening just enough to show that this wasn't just procedure anymore, it was personal. "Who's backing you? Because this town doesn't run on secrets," and for a moment, just a brief moment, the old man's gaze drifted toward the window at the side of the hall, where late afternoon sunlight spilled across the wooden floor in long, quiet lines, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost gentle. "People needed help," he said, as if that answered everything, as if that was the only explanation that had ever mattered, and the simplicity of it hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Heavier than it should have been, because it didn't sound like an excuse, it sounded like a decision, and that was what made it dangerous. The mayor did not like that answer, not because it was wrong, but because it gave him nothing to control, and control was the one thing he had built his entire career around, so he stepped closer, his polished shoes tapping against the wooden floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "That is not how this works," he said, his tone tightening as he turned slightly to address the room as much as the man in front of him. "We have systems. We have accountability, we have laws that protect people from exactly this kind of interference," and the word hung there, heavier than it should have been, as if helping someone quietly had somehow become a violation, and Thomas Hale did not move, did not react, he simply stood there with the same calm presence, the kind that did not challenge authority but did not bend to it either, and that unsettled people more than anger ever could, because anger could be argued with, but silence like his forced them to confront something they could not define. "You expect us to believe you just walk around at night handing out money?" Brooks continued, his voice rising slightly now, drawing murmurs from the crowd. No records, no oversight, no explanation, and somewhere in the back row, a woman shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse, her eyes flicking between the mayor and the old man, because she knew exactly where one of those envelopes had come from, even if she had never seen the face that delivered it, and she was not the only one. But no one spoke yet, the tension in the room holding them in place like a quiet pressure building behind glass, and near the side aisle, Emily Carter stood with her arms folded, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental, her gaze fixed on Thomas not with suspicion but with recognition of something she could not quite explain, something in the way he carried himself, the way he listened without defending, the way his eyes seemed to measure the room not for threats but for need. And it made her uneasy in a different way, because it felt familiar, like something she had seen before but could not yet place. We pulled footage from 3 different locations, Brooks continued, gesturing to a stack of printed still images on the table beside him, each one showing the same figure, the same jacket, the same quiet movement in the middle of the night. And every trail leads back to you, he said, turning one of the photos outward for the room to see, grainy but unmistakable. Thomas Hale standing beside a mailbox, head slightly bowed. As if the act itself required no audience, and a few people leaned forward, whispering to each other now, the story shifting in their minds from rumor to reality, from mystery to accusation, and still, Thomas did not deny it, did not confirm it. He simply looked at the image for a brief moment before his gaze returned to the mayor, steady and unshaken. If you have something to say, now would be the time, Brooks pressed, his patience thinning into something sharper, and the room seemed to lean in with him, waiting, expecting, demanding something more than silence. But when Thomas finally spoke again, his voice carried the same quiet weight as before, unchanged by the pressure around him. Some problems do not wait for paperwork, he said, and the words moved through the room differently this time, not as a deflection, but as a statement that felt uncomfortably true, and Emily felt it immediately, a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like a door opening just enough to let something real slip through. And for the first time since the meeting began, doubt did not belong to the old man standing alone at the front of the room, it belonged to everyone else. The mayor's jaw tightened, not because he had been challenged, but because he had not been, and that lack of resistance left him with nothing to push against, nothing to control. So he turned abruptly toward the long table behind him where a young clerk had been quietly organizing documents. "Bring me his belongings," Brooks said, his voice clipped and decisive. And a ripple of confusion moved through the room as the clerk hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward with a small, worn leather satchel that looked like it had been carried for decades. Its edges softened, its color faded by time and use, and when it was placed on the table, it made almost no sound at all, as if even the object understood the weight of the moment. "If you have nothing to hide," Brooks continued, glancing back at Thomas, "then you will not mind us taking a closer look." And again, there was no protest, no sudden movement. Thomas simply gave a slight nod, the kind that did not signal permission as much as indifference to the outcome, and that unsettled the mayor even more, because men who had something to lose usually showed it, and this man did not even a flicker. The clerk carefully opened the satchel, the faint creak of aged leather barely audible in the quiet room, and inside there was no stack of cash, no documents tied to any organization, no sign of anything illegal or elaborate, just a single, thick notebook, its cover worn smooth, its corners rounded from years of handling. And when the clerk lifted it out, a few people leaned forward instinctively, drawn not by what they expected to find, but by the absence of everything else. "That is it?" Brooks asked, unable to keep the edge of disbelief out of his voice, and the clerk nodded, placing the notebook gently on the table, and for a moment, no one moved, as if opening it required a kind of permission that had not yet been given. "Go ahead," Brooks said finally, gesturing with a sharp motion of his hand, and the clerk flipped the cover open. The pages inside filled not with financial records or coded transactions, but with names, rows and rows of them, written in steady, careful handwriting, each line followed by a short note, a date, sometimes an address, sometimes just a single word like paid, covered, or safe. And the room shifted again, the tension changing shape, because this did not look like a scheme, it looked like a record, a quiet accounting of something no one had been watching. "Read one," Brooks ordered, his voice lower now, less certain, and the clerk swallowed slightly before speaking. "Margaret Ellis, January 12th, hospital bill covered," and a soft sound came from somewhere in the crowd, barely more than a breath, but enough to draw a few heads in that direction. "Next," Brooks said quickly, and the clerk turned the page. "Daniel Ruiz, February 3rd, mortgage caught up," and this time the reaction was not just a sound but a shift, a man near the back straightening in his seat, his expression tightening with recognition. And Emily felt it too, that quiet alignment of stories that had never been connected until now. Each name a thread, each note a moment someone thought had been random. "Keep going," Brooks said, but the authority in his voice had begun to thin. And as the names continued, one after another, the room began to change in a way that no speech could have accomplished. People were no longer looking at Thomas as a suspect, they were looking at him as an answer, and still he stood there the same way he had from the beginning, hands relaxed, shoulders steady, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had never expected it to stay hidden forever, and in the front row, Emily took a slow step closer to the table, her eyes scanning the pages, her mind moving faster now, connecting details. Patterns, something larger than simple generosity, something organized, intentional, and far beyond what one man should have been able to do alone, and as she looked back at Thomas, there was no accusation in her gaze anymore, only a single, growing question that no one in that room had yet thought to ask. Not what he had done, but how. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it was undeniable, like a current moving beneath the surface that everyone could feel but no one had yet named, and Mayor Brooks saw it too, saw the way the eyes that had once been fixed on him for answers were now drifting back toward the old man standing quietly at the center of it all, so he moved quickly, stepping forward again as if proximity alone could restore control. "A list does not explain anything," he said, sharper now, his voice cutting across the low murmur that had begun to build. "Anyone can write down names. That does not make this legitimate," and it was a reach. Everyone in the room felt it, because the notebook did not look like something created for show, it looked like something maintained with purpose, with consistency, with time, and Emily Carter stepped closer to the table, her fingers hovering just above the pages before she gently turned another, her eyes scanning faster now, not just reading but analyzing. "Connecting these dates," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, "they line up," and Brooks turned toward her immediately, seizing the interruption. "Line up with what?" he demanded, but she did not answer right away, her attention locked onto a pattern that was becoming clearer with every page, names followed by events that had once seemed isolated, a foreclosure avoided here, a surgery completed there, a utility restored just in time before winter temperatures dropped below freezing, each one a moment that had been treated as a stroke of luck until now. "These are not random," she said finally, lifting her gaze toward the room, her voice steady but carrying a weight that shifted the air again. "Every entry matches a verified hardship case in this town over the last 2 years," and a quiet ripple spread through the crowd, people turning to each other, whispers forming into something more certain, more grounded, because they recognized those moments, they had lived them. "That still does not explain the source," Brooks pressed, but the edge was fading now, replaced by something less certain, something closer to concern, and Emily nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without surrendering her own. "No, it does not," she said, her eyes moving back to the notebook, "but it does explain the intent." And that word landed differently, softer but heavier, because intent was not something easily dismissed, not when it was written line by line across years of quiet action, and as she turned another page, something else caught her attention, a column she had not noticed before, smaller, written in tighter script along the margins, not names this time, but initials, followed by short codes. Combinations of letters and numbers that meant nothing to most of the room but triggered something immediate in her mind, something she had seen before in a completely different context, and she leaned closer, her brow tightening slightly as she traced one of the entries with her eyes. "This is not just a list," she said, more focused now, her voice lowering as if the realization itself required space. "This is coordination," and Brooks frowned, the word not fitting into the narrative he had been building. "Coordination with who?" he asked, and for the first time since the meeting began. Emily did not look at him when she answered, her gaze fixed instead on Thomas Hale, who stood exactly where he had been from the start, unchanged, unshaken, as if this moment had always been coming and he had simply chosen not to rush it. "That is the part we have not understood yet," she said, and there was something in her tone now that carried both caution and respect, because whatever system this was, it was not reckless, it was precise. And precision like that did not come from chance, it came from experience, from structure, from something that existed long before this town ever noticed it, and as the room settled into that realization, the question shifted again, no longer about whether Thomas had done these things, but about how many others might have been doing it with him, quietly, consistently, without ever stepping into the light. The word coordination lingered in the air like something that did not belong in a small town meeting, too structured, too deliberate, and Mayor Brooks felt it slipping further out of his grasp, so he shifted his stance, crossing his arms as if bracing himself against something he could not yet see. "You are suggesting this is organized," he said, trying to reframe the narrative into something he could still challenge. "That only makes this more serious." But Emily did not flinch at that, her attention already moving ahead, following the pattern rather than the accusation, because the more she looked, the clearer it became that this was not random generosity, it was a system, quiet and precise, and systems always left traces if you knew where to look, and she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her phone with a quick, practiced motion, her thumb already moving across the screen as she cross-checked one of the initials from the margin against a database she had access to through her work, her breathing steady but slightly slower now, focused, because something about those codes felt familiar in a way she could not ignore, and as she typed, the room continued to shift around her, the whispers growing softer, less accusatory, more uncertain, people no longer watching Thomas as a suspect but as a center point they did not yet understand, and at the front, the clerk remained frozen beside the open notebook, as if turning another page without instruction might disrupt something important. And then Emily stopped typing, her thumb hovering just above the screen as her eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt but in recognition, and she looked up again, this time directly at Thomas, studying him more closely, not his clothes or his posture, but the stillness behind it, the kind that did not come from age alone. These initials, she said slowly, her voice carrying just enough to pull the room back into focus, they are not random either, and Brooks exhaled sharply, impatience creeping back in. Then what are they? He asked, but there was less authority in the question now, more need than command, and Emily held her phone up slightly, not to show the screen but to anchor what she was about to say. They match records, she said, not local records, not state records, federal coordination identifiers, and that changed the air completely, not louder, not more chaotic, but heavier, because federal was not a word people used lightly in a room like this, and a man near the back shifted again, his expression tightening as if the ground beneath him had moved just enough to make him aware of it. That is not possible, Brooks said quickly, but it sounded less like a denial and more like a reflex, and Emily did not argue, she simply continued, her tone steady, grounded in what she was seeing rather than what she was told to believe. Each code corresponds to a separate account, not personal, not corporate, something else, something structured to move quietly, and she paused for just a moment, letting that settle before adding the part that mattered most, and they are all active, and the silence that followed was not confusion anymore, it was realization beginning to form, slow but undeniable, because active meant ongoing. It meant this was not something that had happened once or twice. It was still happening, even now, and as that thought settled into the room, every eye drifted back to Thomas Hale again, but this time there was no accusation in it, no dismissal, only a growing awareness that the man standing in front of them was connected to something far larger than a town budget or a set of local rules, and still, he had not moved, had not defended himself, had not even stepped forward. He simply stood there with the same quiet presence, as if the truth did not need his help to arrive, and for the first time since the meeting began, Mayor Brooks did not speak immediately, because whatever he had prepared no longer fit what was unfolding in front of him, and the question in the room was no longer whether Thomas Hale had broken the system, but whether he had been part of something the system itself did not even know existed. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like something settling into place that no one had expected to find, and Emily felt it in the way the room held its breath, not out of fear, but out of realization, because what she was seeing on her phone was no longer just unusual, it was structured in a way that pointed beyond anything local, beyond anything accidental, and she lowered the device slightly, her eyes returning to the notebook on the table as if the two were now part of the same story. These accounts are not personal, she said, her voice steady but quieter now, as if the volume itself needed to match the weight of the discovery. They are distributed, layered, designed to avoid attention, and Mayor Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come as quickly this time, because he could feel the ground shifting beneath his authority, the narrative he had built unraveling not through defiance, but through clarity, and that was harder to fight. You are saying this is some kind of network, he said finally, and Emily nodded once, slow and certain. Yes, she replied, and not a recent one. And that was when the detail that had been sitting quietly on the edge of her awareness moved into focus, something small but undeniable, and she turned one of the pages back, her finger tracing along the margin where the codes were written, stopping at one entry near the top, the ink slightly faded compared to the rest. Older, this code, she said, her voice tightening just enough to signal importance. It was first activated over 30 years ago. And the number landed in the room with a weight that numbers rarely carried, because 30 years was not a coincidence, it was not a short-term solution, it was time measured in lives, in careers, in things that endured, and a man near the front shifted in his chair, his expression changing as he tried to reconcile that span with the quiet man standing only a few feet away, and for the first time, someone in the room asked the question out loud, not directed at the mayor, not even at Emily, but into the space itself. How could one person do that? And no one answered immediately, because the answer was already forming in the silence, and it did not point to one person, it pointed to many, and Emily understood it fully now. Not just the structure, but the intent behind it, the kind of intent that did not fade with time, that did not depend on recognition, and she looked at Thomas again, really looked this time, not as a subject of investigation, but as a man who had been part of something long before this room ever questioned him. You were not working alone, she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement that felt inevitable, and Thomas did not deny it, did not confirm it with words. He simply met her gaze for a brief moment, and in that moment there was something unmistakable, not secrecy, not defiance, but acknowledgement, the kind that did not need explanation, and it was enough, because Emily turned back toward the room, her voice carrying more clearly now, grounded in what she had pieced together. This is a support network, she said, quiet, coordinated, long-term, designed to step in where systems fail without ever replacing them, and the way she said it removed any remaining doubt, because it did not sound like a theory, it sounded like something already proven, something already lived, and Mayor Brooks felt it slip completely beyond his reach, the situation no longer his to define. No longer something that could be contained within policy or procedure, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not step forward, did not assert control. He simply stood there, watching the same man he had called a problem become something else entirely in the eyes of everyone around him, something that could not be reduced to a violation or a case, something that had been there all along, working quietly, steadily, without asking for permission, and the realization settled into the room not with noise, but with a kind of stillness that carried far more weight than any argument ever could. The realization did not explode, it settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a long moment no one in the room spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever they had prepared no longer fit what stood quietly in front of them, and it was Emily who moved first, not dramatically, not with authority, but with purpose, stepping slightly away from the table as she lifted her phone again, her thumb hesitating for just a second before she selected a contact that most people in that room would never have had access to, a number she had not used in years but had never deleted, and when she brought the phone to her ear, the sound of it connecting seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the stillness like a signal that something beyond the room was about to be pulled into it, and Mayor Brooks noticed immediately, his posture tightening as he watched her. "Who are you calling?" he asked, but there was no interruption, no demand to stop, because even he understood now that this was no longer something he could contain with a raised voice, and Emily did not answer right away. Her attention focused on the line as it rang once, then twice, and then a voice came through, calm, professional, precise, the kind of voice that did not ask unnecessary questions. "This is Carter," Emily said, her tone shifting subtly, more formal now, more aligned with something structured and distant from the small town setting around her. "I need verification on a legacy coordination network, identifiers match federal distribution protocols, long-term activity, over 3 decades, and there was a pause on the other end, not long, but enough to signal that what she had just said had landed with significance. And the response, when it came, was lower, more controlled. "Stand by," and she did, lowering the phone slightly but not breaking the connection, her eyes moving once more toward Thomas Hale, who had not reacted at all, not to the call, not to the shift in tone, not to the growing awareness that whatever this was, it was reaching far beyond the walls of the town hall, and that lack of reaction said more than any explanation could have, because it meant this was not new to him, this was not unexpected, it was simply something he had allowed to remain unseen until it no longer could be, and around them, the room held its silence. People no longer whispering, no longer questioning, just waiting, because even without understanding the details, they could feel the scale of what was unfolding, and then Emily's phone shifted slightly in her hand as the voice returned, no longer neutral, now edged with something sharper, something that carried both recognition and urgency. "Confirm the primary name," the voice said. And Emily did not hesitate. "Thomas Hale," she replied, clear and steady. And the response came almost immediately this time, not louder, but heavier. "Do not proceed locally," the voice said, "maintain position," and there was a brief pause before the final instruction, one that changed everything without raising its volume. "We are notifying command," and the line went quiet again, but the words remained, hanging in the air between Emily and the man she had just named, and slowly, deliberately, she lowered the phone completely. her gaze never leaving Thomas, because now she understood not just the structure, not just the coordination, but the scale, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but carried further than before. "Someone is coming," she said, and this time, no one asked who, because the way she said it made the answer unnecessary, and at the front of the room, Mayor Brooks stood completely still, the authority he had carried into the meeting no longer something he could rely on, because whatever was about to arrive did not answer to him, and for the first time since this began, the man who had demanded explanations found himself waiting for one. Time stretched in a way no one in the room had experienced before, not slow enough to notice each second, but heavy enough that every movement seemed deliberate, every sound carried farther than it should have, and outside the tall windows of the town hall, the late afternoon light had begun to soften, casting long shadows across the pavement as if the day itself was preparing to step aside for something else, and inside, no one spoke, not the mayor, not the clerk, not even the quiet murmurs that had filled the room earlier, because now there was nothing left to speculate, only something to witness, and Thomas Hale remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, hands relaxed, posture steady, his gaze calm but distant, not focused on any one person but on something beyond them, something that had already moved into place long before anyone in that room realized it was coming, and then it happened, not with noise or urgency, but with precision, a low, controlled sound outside. The kind that did not belong to traffic or everyday movement, and a few heads turned toward the windows, just slightly, not enough to break the stillness, but enough to acknowledge the change, and through the glass, a dark vehicle came into view, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate, pulling to a stop with a kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself, and behind it, another, positioned with the same care, the same spacing, and the doors did not open immediately. Which somehow made it feel even more significant, because whatever was arriving was not rushed, it was certain, and inside the room, Mayor Brooks straightened slightly, instinctively, as if responding to something ingrained rather than something he understood, his earlier confidence replaced by a measured stillness that mirrored the room itself, and Emily stood just a few feet away from Thomas now, her phone lowered at her side, her attention fixed on the entrance as if she already knew what would follow. And when the doors finally opened, the sound was almost too quiet to notice, but every person in that room felt it, a shift, not in volume, but in presence, as a man stepped inside, tall, composed, his uniform precise without being ostentatious, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, and he did not look around the room, did not acknowledge the crowd or the officials or the tension that had built inside those walls. His focus moved directly, unerringly, to one person, Thomas Hale, and in that moment, everything else in the room seemed to fall away, because recognition does not need introduction, it carries its own weight, and as he approached, his steps measured and unhurried, the air seemed to hold itself in place, waiting, and when he stopped just a few feet in front of the old man, there was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, but respectful, and then, without a word, he straightened fully and raised his hand in a clean, deliberate motion, a salute that was not casual, not symbolic, but exact, held with a precision that spoke of training and meaning far beyond the gesture itself, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the significance of that single action moved through the room faster than any explanation ever could, and Thomas Hale, who had stood in silence through accusation, through doubt, through every question thrown at him, did not return the salute immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of something deeper, something measured. And when he finally lifted his hand, the motion was slower, but no less precise, meeting the gesture with a quiet acknowledgement that carried decades within it, and in that exchange, brief and wordless, the truth that had been building in that room did not need to be spoken anymore, because everyone there understood, not fully, not in detail, but enough to know that whatever they had thought they were confronting, they had been standing in front of something entirely different all along. The room remained still, each second stretching like the calm before a storm, but the storm was not one of noise or chaos, it was one of realization, and as General Whitaker held the salute, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the old man in front of him to respond in a way that could shift the very nature of what had unfolded. When Thomas Hale finally lowered his hand, it was not in a hurried motion but deliberate, with purpose, as if the action itself had weight, like a final acknowledgement of the years of silence that had led to this moment. The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, but suffused with something that could not be explained away, because in that small, quiet room, The past was not something that could be dismissed or rewritten, it was something that had simply waited for its time to be seen. General Whittaker held his position, his gaze fixed on Thomas, not with command, but with a kind of respect that transcended rank, and after a moment, he finally spoke, his voice steady, yet carrying the kind of authority that could only come from years of service. "It has been a long time, Thomas," he said quietly, and the name seemed to hang in the air, heavy with recognition, heavy with the history behind it. And for the first time in this meeting, Thomas spoke, his voice low, but the words carrying across the room with a steady, unwavering truth. "Not long enough, Robert," he said, his eyes meeting the general's, and in those few words, the weight of their shared history, the untold stories, the quiet sacrifices, was felt by everyone in the room. The mayor, still standing rigid at the front, now understood that whatever he had assumed this meeting would be, it had already shifted into something else entirely, and his authority, which had once felt like an immovable force, now seemed insignificant in the face of the quiet dignity that stood before him. Thomas Hale had not fought for recognition, not fought for applause or acknowledgement, and that was perhaps what made the moment so powerful. He had simply been there, in the background, moving through the years with a purpose that had never required a spotlight. And now, with a simple exchange of glances and a few words, the truth that had been silently woven through the fabric of the town for so long was no longer something to question, it was something that could not be ignored. General Whittaker straightened slightly, his posture still professional, but now there was a depth to his presence that had not been there before. "We will take it from here," he said, his voice resonating with authority, but there was a softness in his tone that acknowledged what had come before, what Thomas had quietly built, and the respect he had earned without ever asking for it. And with that, the tension in the room began to ease, the weight of the unspoken history lifting just enough to allow for the next steps to be taken, steps that no longer required explanation, because the truth had already been revealed, quietly, without fanfare, and with more impact than anything else could have ever achieved.